playfully called him my little puppy at the restaurant, the waiter's face when he responded. Hello, Reddit. My name is Emily, and I'm 34 years old. From the outside, my life probably looks perfect. I'm married to Mark, a wonderful man who's been my husband for 12 years. We have 2 amazing kids, a cozy house in the suburbs, and a routine that runs like clockwork. To anyone looking in, I'm living the dream. But inside, it feels like I'm living a lie. And the worst part is, it's a lie of my own making. For the past 3 years, I've been having an affair. His name is Jake. He's a gym instructor I met when I signed up for a fitness class after having my second child. At first, it was just harmless fun. Jake was charming and confident, always quick with a flirty comment or a joke. I laughed it off at the time, thinking it was all in good humor, but then the compliments started getting more personal. He'd tell me how great I looked, how he couldn't believe I was a mom of 2. I told myself it was innocent, that it didn't mean anything. But the truth is, I liked the attention. I liked feeling noticed. Our conversations became longer, more intimate. I started looking forward to my gym sessions, not for the workout, but for Jake. Before I even realized what was happening, we were meeting outside the gym for coffee, then dinner, then more. It all escalated so quickly, but it felt so natural at the time. I told myself that it didn't matter, that it wasn't affecting my family because everything at home stayed the same. And that's true, in a way. Mark didn't notice a difference. He still came home every evening, kissed me on the cheek, and asked how my day was. He still helped the kids with their homework, still held my hand when we watched TV together. He was the same kind, attentive husband he'd always been. But that was the problem. He never changed, and over time, I started seeing his steadiness as predictability, his devotion as weakness. I know how awful that sounds. Mark is the kind of man any woman would dream of marrying. He works hard, takes care of the kids, and never complains about anything. He's patient to a fault, the kind of person who lets other drivers cut him off in traffic without even honking. But while I should have appreciated those things, they started to annoy me. Jake, on the other hand, was bold and assertive. He challenged me, made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. And once I started comparing the 2 of them, Mark didn't stand a chance. I began noticing every little thing Mark did that annoyed me. The way he folded his laundry, the way he always ordered the same thing at restaurants, the way he smiled politely at people who were rude to him. I started making jokes about it, little comments here and there, always with a playful tone so I could pass them off as harmless teasing. I'd call him predictable or too nice, and laugh it off, but I could see the way his face would fall for just a second before he smiled and shrugged it off. At first it was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but over time the remarks became more frequent and more biting. And I expected that he would react or retort with a biting response, or do something that would make me regret my actions. But he never did. No matter how many little digs I made, no matter how dismissive or condescending I became, Mark stayed the same. He'd laugh awkwardly or change the subject, but he never fought back. And the more he let it slide, the more I resented him for it. It's twisted, I know, but I started seeing his patience and kindness as weakness. In my mind, I told myself that I deserved better, that I deserved someone who could match my energy, my passion, someone like Jake. Looking back, I think part of me wanted Mark to figure it out. I wanted him to confront me, to demand answers, to force me to choose. But he never did. He just kept going, day after day, being the perfect husband and father, while I tested the limits of his love and patience. The worst part is, I convinced myself that it didn't matter, that as long as Mark didn't know about Jake, it wasn't really hurting him. But deep down, I think I knew. I knew I was chipping away at the foundation of our marriage, bit by bit, with every joke, every insult, every little test I threw at him. I just didn't care. Or maybe I didn't want to admit that I cared, because that would mean facing the reality of what I was doing. And then there was the restaurant. That one night where everything I thought I had under control came crashing down, but I'll get to that. For now, I just want to say, if you're reading this and thinking I'm a terrible person, you're right. I know I am. But I need to tell this story because if I don't, I think it'll eat me alive. Mark was quite different from all the other guys I dated in the past. He was steady, dependable, and calm in a way that made me feel safe. Before Mark, my relationships had been a whirlwind of chaos. My exes were the kind of guys who lived for drama, who made big promises and even bigger messes. They were exciting, sure, but they left me feeling drained and unsure of myself. Mark was different. He was the kind of man who showed up on time, who remembered little details about me and always followed through on his word. He was solid in a way that felt like home. When we started dating, he didn't play games or keep me guessing. He was open and honest, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I could exhale. I didn't have to fight to earn his affection or prove my worth. He loved me for who I was, flaws and all. We got married a few years later in a small ceremony with just close family and friends. Life with Mark was good, stable, comfortable, easy. We bought a house, built careers, and eventually had our 2 kids. He was a great father from the start, the kind who got up for midnight feedings without being asked and knew how to soothe a crying baby better than I did. Watching him with our children made me love him even more, or at least it used to. About 3 years ago, after I had our second child, I decided it was time to focus on myself again. I put on some weight during pregnancy, and while Mark always reassured me that I was beautiful, I didn't feel it. I joined a gym to get back in shape, to feel more like the woman I was before kids. That's where I met Jake. As I said before, our relationship grew so rapidly from being just a gym instructor and a member of the gym to something more dangerous and risky. During our sessions, we talked about everything: our goals, our dreams, our frustrations. He listened in a way that made me feel seen, and I realized how much I'd missed that. At home, everything with Mark had become so routine, so predictable, but with Jake, everything felt exciting and new. One day, he had even offered me a free personal training session. "Just to help you out," he said with that easy grin of his. I accepted, and that's when things started to change. The first time Jake asked me to meet him outside the gym, I told myself it was just 2 friends grabbing coffee. I didn't see the harm in it. But that coffee turned into dinner, and dinner turned into something I couldn't take back. The first time we kissed, it felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't stop. I didn't want to. Our affair escalated quickly after that. After the kiss. We started meeting in secret whenever we could, at hotels or in places where we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. Jake made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. He told me how beautiful I was, how he couldn't believe someone like me was stuck in such a boring life. And I believed him. I wanted to believe him. When he undresses me in the privacy of the hotel room or the other places where we would meet secretly. When he kisses my shoulder and tells me how wonderfully made I am. When he would stare at my naked body entwined with his in the bed of adultery and tell me I looked beautiful. And when he plunges deep into my vulva and kisses my breast and says how he couldn't get enough of me. I wanted to believe him so bad. He felt like everything that Mark wasn't, and I wanted badly to believe that my illusion would last. But in the end, it didn't. It had ended as fast as it had begun. At home, nothing changed, at least not outwardly. I still cooked dinner every night, helped the kids with their homework, and did all the things a good wife and mother was supposed to do. Mark didn't seem to notice anything was different. He was still his usual self, kind, patient, devoted. He never questioned where I was when I came home late from the gym, or why I was suddenly spending so much more time on my appearance. He trusted me completely, and I took full advantage of that trust. I told myself the affair didn't matter because it didn't affect my family. I convinced myself that as long as Mark didn't know, it wasn't hurting anyone. I was careful to keep my 2 lives separate, and for a while, it worked. Life went on as usual. Mark didn't complain, didn't suspect a thing, or so I thought. But looking back now, I see how blind I was. I see the little signs I ignored, the quiet moments when Mark's expression changed, even if just for a second. I thought I was in control, that I was getting away with it. But the truth is, I was only fooling myself. And I didn't realize how much damage I was doing until it was too late. At some point, I don't even know when it started, I began to feel different. It wasn't just about the affair or Jake's attention, it was the way being with him made me feel about myself. For the first time in years, I felt bold, confident, even untouchable. It was like I had unlocked some version of myself that had been buried under years of routine and responsibilities. I carried that feeling home with me, letting it seep into the way I interacted with Mark. At first, it was subtle. I'd make small comments here and there, little digs disguised as jokes. When Mark came home one evening with groceries and proudly showed me that he'd remembered to buy my favorite snacks, I laughed and said, What would you do without my shopping list? He smiled at the time, but I noticed the way he hesitated before putting the groceries away. I didn't think much of it. It was just a joke, right? But as time went on, the comments became more frequent and more biting. I started teasing him about how much he doted on me, calling him predictable or too nice, in that playful tone that made it sound like a compliment but wasn't. One night, we were watching TV after the kids had gone to bed, and he asked me if I wanted a cup of tea. "Of course you're making tea," I said with a laugh. "You're so predictable, Mark. You always do the same thing every night." He didn't respond, just got up and went to the kitchen. I heard the kettle boiling, and for a moment I felt bad, but then I shook it off. It was just a joke. I started testing him in little ways, pushing the boundaries to see how far I could go. When he folded the laundry, I'd point out how he never folded the towels the way I liked. When he tried to help the kids with their homework, I'd tease him about how he was overcomplicating it. He always took it in stride, laughing along or shrugging it off, but I could see it in his eyes. There was a quiet sadness there, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. And instead of stopping, I kept going. The more confident I felt with Jake, the more dismissive I became at home. I started to see Mark's steadiness as boring, his kindness as weakness. I didn't mean to hurt him, not really. But I liked the way it felt to be in control, to be the one with the upper hand. I didn't realize how much I was taking advantage of his patience, how much I was pushing him further and further away. Looking back, I can see the little signs I ignored. The way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. The way he started spending more time at work, staying late even when he didn't need to. The way he seemed quieter, more withdrawn, like he was walking on eggshells around me. At the time, I told myself he was just tired or stressed. I didn't want to admit that I was the reason he was pulling away. I thought I was in control, that I could keep everything separate, the affair, my marriage, my family. But every joke, every little dig, every dismissive comment was like a crack in the foundation of what we had built together. And I didn't see it until it was too late. Mark had planned the dinner weeks in advance. He told me he wanted to celebrate our anniversary properly, so he made reservations at one of the nicest restaurants in town. It wasn't the kind of place we usually went to. White tablecloths, soft lighting, and a piano playing in the background. It was clear he had put a lot of thought into it, but to me, it felt unnecessary, like he was trying too hard. I didn't say that, of course. I just went along with it, already half detached from the moment before it even began. He had gotten to the restaurant before me and had ordered his favorite wine. When I arrived there, he didn't even stand up or acknowledge my presence, which felt really weird. Something was off. It didn't seem like the Mark that was really excited about celebrating our anniversary. He just looked at him over the rim of his wine glass and then set it aside. Mark didn't say anything to me at that point, and I felt really nervous, so I tried to lighten up the mood. I started talking about anything and everything just to get over the awkward silence at the table. I talked about the ambience of the restaurant and the location and how easy it was to find. I started to joke about how easy it was for Mark to find things like that. I said he was like the woman in our relationship because, well, he usually handled things well. Then I teased him about being such a loyal puppy to me. It was only a joke, said to lighten up the mood, but I saw how the waiter who had come to take our order froze and looked between us anxiously before professionally ignoring what I said and asked what we wanted for dinner. I ordered my favorite, and Mark had placed his own order before the waiter subtly disappeared. Mark still didn't say anything, just looked at me and smiled. When our food arrived, he gave me an envelope and tagged it my anniversary gift. I was surprised, and when I opened it, I got the shock of my life. There were pictures of texts between Jake and I. Then there were pictures of my supposed private meetings with Jake. One of the pictures had Jake and I leaning against each other in a way that suggested intimacy. Another one was a picture of Jake and I kissing right in front of a hotel room. And there had been one of us naked and having sex. I was so shocked, and the picture slipped out of my shaking hand to the ground. I was so shocked I couldn't say anything. I didn't have to. All the evidence spoke against me, and there was nothing I could say to deny anything or prove my innocence when I actually was anything but innocent. The same waiter passed by our table, and he saw the pictures on the ground, and I saw the way his eyes widened, and he looked at me again, this time in disgust. It was easy to guess what was happening. People started whispering and looking at us. Mark still didn't say anything and just ate his food quietly, like he hadn't just literally exposed my secret. When he finished his food, he paid for the meal and just left. He didn't even wait for me or ask me any questions. He just simply stood up without looking at me and left. When I finally arrived home, the house was dark except for the light coming from our bedroom. I went upstairs, still reeling from what had happened at the restaurant, and found Mark packing a suitcase. For a moment, I didn't believe what I was seeing. He wasn't rushing or angry. His movements were deliberate, methodical, like he had been preparing for this moment for a long time. I asked him what he was doing, trying to keep my voice steady, even as panic started to creep in. He didn't look at me at first, didn't acknowledge me until I pressed him again. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but there was no softness in it. He told me he was leaving. He didn't explain, didn't try to justify it. He simply said he couldn't do it anymore. I tried to explain why I felt the need to cheat. Even as I was trying to justify my actions, my words felt empty, and I felt stupid trying to explain what I did. Mark didn't say anything to me. He continued packing, his face unreadable. And then he had finally turned to him, his eyes cold and cutting through my skin. He said he had known about the affair a year ago, and that he had been gathering the evidence against me so he could finally use them to destroy me. He told me that every one of our family members probably already had the pictures with them. And he said he purposely left out my workplace because he couldn't care less what happened between Jake and I. My breath caught as the weight of his words sank in. He explained, still calm and detached, that he had kept quiet, waiting to see if I would come to my senses. But I didn't. And he had plotted his revenge for a whole year, keeping quiet and leaving me to think that I was being careful and that I thought of him as a loyal puppy, while he was only just trying to find the best way to avenge himself. He didn't raise his voice or lash out. There was no anger, just a quiet finality that made it clear he had already made up his mind. He made up his mind a year ago. But I had been stupid enough to not notice. I thought Mark was just simply being Mark. I spoke to him harshly and thought he would never react to it because he was that sort of person. I underestimated him. I became desperate at that moment. I went on my knees frantically begging. I tried to explain, to justify what I had done. I told him it didn't mean anything, that it was a mistake, but he didn't respond. He didn't argue or get defensive. He just continued packing, his silence more damning than anything he could have said. I begged him to stay, to give me another chance, but he didn't even look at me. When he was done, he zipped up the suitcase and walked to the door. He said he would be staying with his brother and that I would be hearing from his lawyer about the divorce. And then he left. I stood there in the silence, staring at the empty doorway, the weight of my choices crashing down around me. For the first time, I truly understood what I had done. I had destroyed the man who had loved me unconditionally, and now he was gone. And I had no one to blame but myself. I imagine him knowing for a whole year and just looking at me self-destructing. He had known all this while, and he just quietly plotted his revenge. Mark wasn't the fool I took him for. Turns out I was the fool in our relationship. It's been 3 days since Mark walked out on us, and I cannot begin to tell you just how tormenting it has all been, especially with friends and family giving me the cold shoulder. I have no one on my side, and I'm so desperate at this point. I am scared of losing Mark completely. I can't lose him. Please, guys. Please, is there anything I can do to salvage the situation at this point? Update. Hello, Reddit. I think I am losing my mind. When I woke up the next morning, the morning after Mark left, the first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't the usual quiet of an early morning before the kids woke up. It was heavier, emptier. Mark's side of the bed was cold, and his suitcase was gone. For a second, I thought maybe he'd gone for a walk or left early for work. I thought I could delude myself into thinking so. That he wasn't just gone. That he didn't pack up his suitcase and walked out on our marriage that I ruined. I thought I could pretend that he was still at home and just wasn't in the room with me, as he was always up before anyone in the house. But as I walked through the house, the absence became undeniable. His keys weren't on the hook by the door, and the shoes he always wore were missing. He was simply gone. I grabbed my phone and started texting him. At first, they were short messages. Mark, can we talk? I'm really sorry for everything. We should at least try and make things work because of the kids. But Mark wouldn't respond to any of my texts, so my texts became longer and more frantic. I called him over and over, each time going straight to voicemail. It felt surreal, like this couldn't actually be happening. Mark had always been there, always steady and dependable. I couldn't comprehend the fact that he was actually gone. By the time the kids woke up, I still hadn't heard from him. I tried to act normal, putting on a brave face as I made breakfast, but my oldest, Lily, could sense something was wrong. She asked why Daddy wasn't home, and I stumbled over my words, trying to come up with an excuse that wouldn't raise any more questions. I told her he had to go away for work for a few days, but the way she looked at me, confused and a little hurt, made my chest tighten. I could feel the guilt wrapping around me like a noose, squeezing tighter with every passing minute. Later that day, I drove to Mark's brother's house. I knew he had said he'd be staying there, and I thought if I could just see him, if I could talk to him, I could fix this. I was being shameless, I know. I shouldn't be able to face him, not after everything I did to him, but I was desperate to try and make things work between us. But when I got there, his brother wouldn't let me in. He stood in the doorway, his expression firm but not unkind, and told me it wasn't a good time. I could hear Mark's voice faintly in the background, talking to the kids, and it nearly broke me. I begged to see him, to explain, but his brother just shook his head. He said Mark needed space and that I should respect that. I left feeling more lost than ever, the weight of what I had done pressing down on me like a physical force. In my desperation, I turned to Jake. He was the only person who knew the full extent of what was happening, and I thought maybe he could give me some comfort. I told him that Mark had left, that he had found out about the affair and walked out. Jake's reaction wasn't what I expected. He shrugged it off, acting like it wasn't a big deal. He told me I was better off without someone who couldn't handle me, dismissing Mark as weak and spineless. His words made my stomach turn, though I couldn't figure out why at first. Wasn't this what I had wanted? For Jake to reassure me, to tell me I was better off with him, but instead of feeling comforted, I felt hollow. The more I leaned on Jake, the more I started to see him for who he really was. His charm, which had once felt so magnetic, now seemed shallow. His confidence felt more like arrogance, his attention conditional. He wasn't Mark. He didn't have Mark's quiet strength or his patience. He didn't know how to love me in the way I had taken for granted for so many years. When I mentioned that I was struggling to explain things to the kids, Jake brushed it off, saying they'd be fine and that I was overthinking it. He didn't understand the gravity of what was happening, or maybe he just didn't care. For him, this was just another complication, another distraction from the thrill of our affair. I realized then that I had built Jake up in my mind, projecting all the things I thought I wanted onto him, but the reality was so much less than I had imagined. As the days went on, the silence in the house became unbearable. Every corner of it felt like a reminder of what I had lost. The sight of Mark's favorite mug on the kitchen counter, the faint scent of his cologne lingering on his side of the bed, it all felt like a haunting. I started replaying everything in my mind, every moment that had led to this point. The jokes I had made at his expense, the nights I had come home late without an explanation, the times I had looked at him and seen only what he wasn't instead of what he was. Mark had loved me with a patience and devotion that I had taken for granted. I had mistaken his kindness for weakness, his steadiness for complacency. I thought I wanted more excitement, more passion, but now I could see how much I had already had. Mark wasn't weak. He was strong in ways I had never appreciated, strong enough to love me even when I didn't deserve it. I realized too late how much I'd chipped away at the foundation of our marriage. Every joke, every dismissive comment, every moment I chose Jake over Mark, it had all added up, slowly eroding the trust and respect we had built over the years. And now I was left standing in the rubble, alone with the weight of my choices. The kids felt it too, even if they didn't understand. Lily asked again that night why Daddy wasn't home, and this time I couldn't bring myself to lie. I told her that he needed some time away, but she looked at me with wide, tearful eyes and asked if it was her fault. I broke down at that moment, holding her close and telling her over and over that it wasn't her fault. It was mine. All of it was mine. I don't know how to fix this. I don't even know if it can be fixed. But for the first time in years, I'm starting to see the full extent of the damage I've done, and it terrifies me. Update. Hello, Redditors. This is going to be my last post here. I think I have finally made things even worse than they started off. After days of silence, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to see Mark, to try and explain, to beg him to come home again. I drove to his brother's house, my hands shaking on the steering wheel the entire way. When his brother answered the door, I half expected him to turn me away again, but this time he stepped aside, letting me in without a word. The look on his face told me everything I needed to know. He didn't think this would change anything, but he wasn't going to stop me from trying. Mark was in the living room, sitting on the couch with Lily and Max beside him. They were watching a movie, but the moment I walked in, the mood in the room shifted. Lily's face lit up and she ran to hug me, but Mark didn't move. He didn't speak. He just looked at me, his expression calm and unreadable. I asked if we could talk, and he nodded, standing up and motioning for his brother to stay with the kids. We went into the kitchen, and I started talking before he could say anything. The words spilled out of me in a rush, apologies, promises, desperate pleas. I told him I would end things with Jake, that I already had. I told him I would go to therapy, that I would do anything to fix what I had broken. I begged him to come home, to give me another chance. My voice broke more than once, and I could feel the tears streaming down my face, but I didn't care. I had to make him understand how sorry I was, so I just poured out my heart and hoped that he would decide to give us a second chance and let go of the past. Mark listened quietly, letting me say everything I needed to say. When I finally stopped, when there was nothing left to add, when there was no English word left in my brain to apologize with, he took a deep breath and told me something that left me shattered and knowing that his decision was final. He told me that he couldn't come back. He said he wasn't angry anymore, just tired. He said that the trust between us was gone, and without trust, there was no foundation left to rebuild. He told me he couldn't stay married to someone who didn't respect him, who had spent years chipping away at his self-worth while building something with someone else. I felt so vulnerable and helpless at that moment. But the part that hurt the most was when he said it wasn't just about me or him anymore. It was about the kids. He said they deserved a better example of what a healthy relationship should look like, and he couldn't give them that if he stayed. I know he probably meant I couldn't give them that. The unspoken word hung between us. I was clearly the failure between both of us. He knew it, and I knew it too. I was the bad example that the kids shouldn't look up to. He continued his speech, and he spoke with such calm certainty, like he had already made peace with his decision, and I realized then that nothing I said or did would change his mind. He had given me so much time in the past year to make up for my bad deeds, but I never did, and now he had his mind made up. When I left, it felt like the final nail in the coffin. There was no screaming, no dramatic argument, just a quiet end to the life we had built together. The aftermath of Mark leaving was like living in a vacuum. The house felt emptier than ever, and every corner of it reminded me of him. His favorite coffee mug still sat in the cabinet, untouched. His clothes, the ones he hadn't taken, hung neatly in the closet, a painful reminder of what was gone. The kids eventually stopped asking why their dad wasn't home. They guessed that much. I pulled my home apart, and now even my kids hate me for driving their patient dad out of the house. They hardly talked to me and preferred to spend their time outside school with their dad. Lily, who once adored me, now looked at me like I had a snake wrapped around my head. She wouldn't talk to me or allow me to talk to her. They prefer being locked up inside their rooms whenever they are at home. The house feels really empty, even with the kids around. It wasn't just the house that felt empty. My life did too. Friends who had once been close began pulling away. Word about the affair had spread, and while no one said it to my face, I could feel the judgment in the way they spoke to me or didn't. Some openly sided with Mark, offering him support while avoiding me altogether. Even family members, people I thought would always stand by me, started keeping their distance. My siblings, who always made sure they called every week to check in on me, never call now. And even when I do call them, there's always an excuse to not speak to me. It was either, I'll call you back, or I'm busy. They never call back. My mom outrightly told me that I was a disgrace to the family and she wants nothing to do with me. So far, she's been keeping her words. Only saw the kids when Mark drops them off at her place. Jake, the one person I thought I could turn to, made it clear he wanted nothing to do with the fallout. When I told him Mark had left, he acted annoyed, as if my crumbling marriage was an inconvenience to him. He dismissed my emotions, telling me to move on and focus on myself. But the final blow came when he told me he couldn't deal with the baggage of my situation and that it would be best if we stopped seeing each other. It was as if he had been waiting for an excuse to end things, and now he had it. In the end, I was left with no one but myself. No Mark, no Jake, no friends or family to lean on. Just the crushing weight of my choices and the silence of an empty house. Sitting alone in that house, I've had a lot of time to think, to replay every decision I made, every moment I chose to hurt the man who loved me unconditionally. I see now how blind I was, how selfish. Mark wasn't weak, he was strong in ways I didn't appreciate. He loved me with patience and kindness even when I didn't deserve it. And I mistook that love for complacency. I convinced myself I needed something more, something exciting, but all I did was destroy the best thing I had. I see now how my words and actions chipped away at the foundation of our marriage. Every joke at his expense, every dismissive comment, every time I chose Jake over him, it all added up until there was nothing left. I thought I was in control, but I was the one who destroyed everything. I know I did this to myself. I made the choices that led to this, and now I'm paying the price. I've lost my husband, my kids, my family, my friends, and my sense of self. And the worst part is knowing it didn't have to be this way. If I had seen sooner what I was doing, if I had stopped before it was too late, maybe I could have saved us. To anyone reading this, please don't make the same mistakes I did. Don't take the people who love you for granted. Don't let boredom or resentment blind you to what you have, because once it's gone, you can never get it back. I would know because my life is now in shambles, rumpled pieces that could never again make a whole. Reddits, I know I did this to myself. I made the choices that led to this, and now I'm paying the price. A costly one, might I add. But I can't help wondering if I had realized sooner. If I had stopped before it was too late, could I have saved us? Could I have avoided all of these if I hadn't decided that the best way around everything was to cheat on Mark and look down on him? Or is this the punishment I deserve for what I've done?